It's my pleasure to welcome you to an important event tonight to discuss two very big topics: the crisis in the Ukraine and the upcoming 7-week series, The Best of Times, The Worst of Times. Let me first start. Is that someone there? Let me first start by acknowledging that our event is being held on the lands of the Wurundjeri people, and I wish to acknowledge them as traditional custodians of the land. I would also like to pay my respects to elders past and present, and to Aboriginal elders of other communities that may be here today. As we're online, I'd also like to extend my respects to other First Peoples wherever you are joining us from Australia. So tonight will be split into two parts. First, we'll explain a little about the upcoming 7-week series, The Best of Times, The Worst of Times, and take questions from our panel and from the audience. And then we'll hear from Joe about the Ukraine crisis, where to from here, and also take questions from the panel and then from the audience. I'm joined here today by Emeritus Professor Joseph Camilleri, the founder of Conversation at the Crossroads, and two of our coordinating group members, Rana Ibrahimi and Lee Manik. Welcome to all of you. So now on to our first part of the night about the best of times, the worst of times. I'm going to hand over to Professor Camilleri in a moment, but I just want to let you know that we have a chat function, which you can see if you scroll with your mouse at the bottom of the screen. You'll see it, and it just says chat. If you click on there, you can type in there and ask questions there, and we have a moderator that will be taking those questions and feeding them through to our panel and to Professor Camilleri. And now I'm going to hand over to Joe to talk about the seminar series before we move on to Ukraine. You're on mute.
Thank you very much, Susan. It's a great pleasure, of course, to join with everyone for what I think hopefully will be a useful conversation over the next hour and a bit. Well, Susan, you've asked me to say a word about the series. Some people have found the title intriguing. The Best of Times, The Worst of Times. Of course, it's drawn from the well-known Charles Dickens' Tale of Two Cities, one of his most famous novels, set against the backdrop of the French Revolution. The highly turbulent times, which promised something for the future, but where the present was turbulent, violent, and often uncertain. And in many ways, that describes our time, doesn't it? There are so many challenges pressing in on us. One day, it's COVID. The next, it's Ukraine. The day after, it's climate change. And then deaths in custody, and then on to some other major challenge. And so the list goes on. And so the question arises, how do we make sense of it all? How do we connect the pieces of the jigsaw puzzle? So in a way, the series is just one attempt, but an in-depth attempt to try and make sense, to see how we can communicate with others about these challenges and how we might be able to respond in meaningful, creative, imaginative ways. So the aim of the series is certainly to inform, to stimulate, absolutely to stimulate, but more than that, to inspire and to equip people to be more effective in the various ways in which they might seek to respond, either on their own, but preferably, of course, together with others, how they might respond to the challenges we face. Well, that's the idea. That's the idea. And for this, I have chosen 7 themes, major themes, which in fact are very closely connected to each other, though the connections are not often well understood. So, for example, we will start with making the connections between COVID and climate change. and to see what it means to live in the time of the pandemic, which is also the time of global warming, and to see whether there are lessons we have learned from this experience. And I will be suggesting, among others, that there are still major, perhaps brutal lessons that we have yet to learn, but we could quite easily learn if we are so inclined. And then we will deal with the question of race. The idea that race is still a legacy, especially of a colonial legacy, which has seen Western white dominance for so long and still manifests itself in so many different places, from the United States to Australia to the UK and many other countries. How to handle it? What does it mean? And might the time of reckoning be coming closer and closer? We will, of course, deal with the grand geopolitical conflicts that are going on, and in particular, the triangular relationship between Russia, China, and the United States. And similarly, we'll go on to deal with a number of other questions, including the role of the media, the role of education in making sense of these challenges and possible responses. What kind of a job are they doing? Would they be doing better? If so, how? And in all of that, the role of conversation, the power of conversation, how it can help us to see with new eyes what sometimes is relatively obscure and distant. Make it closer, make it clearer. And finally, we're going to ask the $64,000 question. Are we going through a watershed moment in human history? And if so, what are the risks, but importantly, what are the opportunities? And what might we be able to do to minimize the risk and maximize the opportunity? So that's what we're going to do. And we're going to try and do it in a variety of ways. Of course, we will have the pleasure and I think the good fortune to have with us over the 7 weeks some outstanding thinkers and practitioners from Greece, joining us from Greece, from China, from Russia, from the UK, from Australia and elsewhere. And the flyer that you have tells you who they are and something of their profile. I'm hoping that we will get some of them interviewed in the lead up to the 7-week series in at least 1 or 2 of our media. We'll see. And more than that, we're going to have opportunities for interaction, for engaging with our guests, for small group discussion, for role play, for debates, for some assignments which have to do with conversation in between the 7 sessions and sharing those insights with the rest of the group, online and in person. And finally, we will have some skilling exercises. How can we become more effective in reading, understanding, communicating, and most importantly, conversing with a wide range of groups who may come from different backgrounds, different age groups, different cultures, different points of view, and how can we make that conversation effective? Not point scoring exercise, effective, productive, imaginative, enriching, because we know we can, but we have to acquire the skills and the settings within which this can be done. So in a nutshell, that's what's going to happen over the 7 weeks. And hopefully people who know about it will be sufficiently interested to want to join us. I hope so.
Thanks, Joe. And I understand that in order to cover costs, that there is a cost for this, and that we are covering that by asking people to pay for the 7-week series. And that's via tribe bookings, and that's to cover the cost of the venue hire and some catering and compensating or remunerating a modest amount to some of those people that will be presenting. And also for the cost that we pay for Zoom as well. So that's all things that we have to take into account. But we do have some, as well as having the full price, there's also a concession that we're offering, and also scholarships for young people. But also, I just wanted to say that today we are also offering a special invite for people that are attending today, a 10% discount, just for the people that are attending today for the next 48 hours. If you add in a code, CROSS10, CROSS10, at the try booking, you can get 10% off that cost. And yeah, so this is only for the next couple of days on try booking. So when you click through, just order as usual. And then when you get to the final checkout page, you can add in that promo code. And hopefully that's an incentive for people to get involved and to think about buying their ticket sooner rather than later. So now I'm just going to go to the panel, Rana and Lee, and see if there are any questions that you want to ask Jo before I go and out to the audience.
I'll dive in first, if that's okay. Jo, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you for the introduction, Jo. Looking forward to the series very much. I imagine a lot of people might be asking themselves, you know, what difference can I make, and what does conversation alone allow us to do in terms of making a difference? So I might just ask you how you think conversation can lead to change, and ask you to offer a few reflections on that point prior to the event.
Right. Well, thank you, Lee. It's a very large question, and I'll only skim through one or two points. In fact, there is a lot of people think there is talk and there is action. It's a binary, and some people go for action and some other people just talk. What a waste of time. In fact, this is absolutely inaccurate. It is false. Not a little false, it's completely false. And why do I say that? Because how can you have action before you've decided what kind of action and what kind of objectives over what time frame? How could you do that except in conversation? There is no action worth the paper on which it's written, no proposed action which can possibly be taken blind. It has to be the result of thought, and it has to be the result of thought engaging with others in that process, and that's conversation. So whether you're thinking of some immediate action or some rather longer term project, there is no alternative to conversation. And in addition to that, conversation sets the framework, which then can enthuse and inspire people to action if they become sufficiently convinced that there are opportunities and that there are things worth doing. But that doesn't come out of a dream overnight, usually. It comes out of being part of conversations, small, large, structured, unstructured, formal, informal, online, in person, whichever way it may be, but conversation it is. So we've got to be able to do it well and to maximum advantage.
Thank you. Rana, is there a question that you have?
Yes, actually. Hi, everyone, and hello, Jo. I have a question. It's another $64,000 question. During the Trump time, we got this buzzword about fake news, and I think it is something that right now we hear it from Putin as well. My question is, in our conversations, how we identify the fake news or misinformation, and the harder question is how we counter it.
Yes, yes, that is a $64,000 question. And you're right, we are surrounded by political spin, not just US or Russia, but right on everyone's doorstep in our respective countries. We're surrounded by platitudes, political spin, I've said, and of course, propaganda. So the one way of doing it, of course, is to apply to a range of issues some detailed thought, and to do it from people who have no axe to grind, to do it with people who have no particular axe to grind, who are there because they are interested by the truth of the situation, and who are willing to share their insights and to learn from others' insights. So we all do it with a spirit of humility. We're not pontificating about what is and what isn't, but we are sharing insights and conclusions and findings, and we're doing it from many sources. We're not relying on just one source. We are not in echo chambers, and equipped with that sense of collective approach across boundaries to the truth. We know that it's a journey. We never have complete mastery of the truth, but we are on a journey whose destination, at least whose destination in the long run, is truth. We never fully achieve it, but we're constantly engaged with it. And we're always asked questions, including of ourselves. So hopefully that approach enables us to counter the pitfalls that are there for us to fall into as best we can, and perhaps with a bit of clearer vision, ideally with a little bit of X-ray vision. So we can see through the spin, the platitudes, and the propaganda.
Just before I ask for questions from the audience, I just wanted to note, like, I am part of a discussion group with Conversation at the Crossroads, and we just met today, and it's actually something we were talking about, was about conversation is so important in those solutions. And all of us in the group had different ideas of what we thought the solutions were. Some of them had them very well formed, and some of them were a bit more vague, but getting to a point where people agree on the solutions is where we come to a place of consensus, and that's actually how the conversations are important in getting the solutions to happen. No one person can execute that solution on their own. They need help from others. So in order to agree it, you need to talk about it. And so I wholeheartedly agree, Joe. And so do you have anything to comment on that?
No, you're saying it very well. I don't need to add.
So I'm really happy now to open up to the audience, and I can see that there's one question there. Lee, are you going to be asking those questions, or do you want me to? Are you?
No, I'm happy to ask those questions. Thanks, Suzanne. Sam, we've had one question come through from a participant. They've asked, how can our conversations be future orientated, the only arena for change?
Say it again. How can our conversations be future oriented? And what?
Yes, how can our conversations be future orientated? I think that's the question. With the statement that that is the only arena for change.
Yes. Well, of course, but to be able to think ahead, which we must, and to see what are the trends, we need to have a good grasp of both the past and the present. So, in conversation, serious, in-depth conversations, we need to have an understanding of all three timeframes. We are desperately interested in the future, and we want to help shape it in a better way than the present. But we have to know where we're at, what are the forces at work, and that requires an understanding of the present. What are the forces at work? What are the roadblocks to the kind of changes we may have in mind? And if there are roadblocks, then we can say, well, what would it take to be able to get around to overcome those roadblocks to the kind of change scenarios we may have in mind, which might lead us to a more promising situation than the one we now have. So yes, it's future oriented, of course, but fully our feet firmly planted in the ground of the now, and informed, of course, by the past. A bit of history hurt nobody.
And I understand, Joe, as a small entree to that, we're going to shortly have you give a small presentation on the crisis in Ukraine. And I think that'll be a lovely connection between that abstract conversation we're having now about the importance of good conversation and how that might take place. And, your points that you just made about us needing to ground that conversation in a sense of history and how that history can inform how we think about the future and look to resolve any crises on hand. So Suzanne, with that in mind, would you like to perhaps introduce the next parts of the session?
Thanks, absolutely. So what we're going to do now is just do a bit of a poll with the audience. We've got 2 questions. So I'm going to just ask the first question first. I think we're going to have the question also up on the screen, and you'll have an opportunity to give your response. So the first question is, what have been your main sources of information and analysis on Ukraine conflict? So you can select up to 3 options. First is mainstream print and online media in Australia and in the US and UK, for example, The Age, Sydney Morning Herald, Guardian, New York Times, Washington Post, and there's a myriad of others. Or is it from local commercial radio and TV networks in Australia, US and UK? It could be both the first and the second, or one or the other. And then thirdly, is it public radio and TV in Australia and the US and the UK, for example, ABC, SBS, BBC, PBS? Tick that if that applies to you too. English language media sources based in non-English speaking countries, for example, Le Monde, Al Jazeera, South China Morning Post, Straits Times, Economic and Political Weekly, Pravda and RT, and there's plenty of others, so please click that if that applies to you. Independent and alternative media outlets, for example, Democracy Now! Or Pearls and Irritations or other blogs. Or what about social media outlets? Do you turn to that as a main source of information? So click the ones that apply to you. It doesn't have to be just limited to one. And I'll leave you another 30 seconds to respond. So just wait for those to come in. So 15 seconds left. Okay, finishing now. How did we all go? Do we have the results?
We might have them perhaps a bit later. I don't know how it works.
Okay, I can say them to people if we want. So on that question, what have been your main sources of information analysis on the Ukraine conflict? 62% said that mainstream media and online media in Australia, US and UK was one of their preferences, including The Age, Sydney Morning Herald, Guardian, New York Times, Washington Post. 10% of people use local commercial radio and TV networks in Australia, US and UK. 76% of people use public radio and TV in Australia, US and UK, for example, ABC, SBS, BBC and PBS. It's the highest percentage. And then 26% of people turn to English language media sources based in non-English speaking countries like Le Monde, Al Jazeera, South China Morning Post, Straits Times, Economic and Political Weekly, Pravda and RT, and I'm sure there's plenty of other sources. And 51% of people had said that they used independent alternative media outlets like Democracy Now!, Pearls and Irritations and other blogs. So now we've got a second question, if I can. So the second question, if we can bring that up, is the dominant narrative of the Ukraine conflict as depicted in mainstream Western media has been accurate, objective and insightful. I want you to answer your preference for this, one of these choices. Do you strongly agree? Do you just agree? Are you undecided? Do you disagree? Or are you in strong disagreement? So I'll ask that again. The dominant narrative of Ukraine conflict as depicted in mainstream Western media has been accurate, objective and insightful. Now I'll wait a little bit to see if we have more people that are putting in their response. 15 more seconds. Okay. Are we ready to see the response? So the question's now closed. How did we go? 2% strongly agree that the dominant narrative of the Ukraine depicted in mainstream Western media has been accurate, objective and insightful. 27% agree, 26 are undecided, 23 disagree and 21 strongly disagree. That's really interesting. So more people strongly disagree than strongly agree. And there's a lot in the middle, agree and undecided and disagree. Very interesting. Something to comment on that, Joe?
Well, I will in the course of my few comments.
Thanks for participating, everyone. What I'll do now is I'll hand over to Joe to give his presentation, and then we'll take questions after that from the panel and then from you.
Thanks very much, Susan. I can be heard okay, can't I? We are dealing with a very, very, very complex situation, hardly needs to be said, and very little can be said in depth in the space of 15 or so minutes. So I'm going to skim over a lot of points, just mention them. Some points, some issues I will hardly deal with, not because they may not be important, but because of the shortage of time, but we may be able to take them up in comments and question time as we go along. So I want to divide my brief comments under three headings. How high are the stakes in this conflict, in this crisis? Secondly, how did we get into this mess? And thirdly, how might we be able to get out of it? So to the question, how high are the stakes? In two words, unbelievably high. This is a tragedy for the people of Ukraine, of course, first and foremost. We can barely imagine the suffering of so many. We need only think at civilian casualties and other results of the fighting so far. Slide 1, please. Now, the UN body, the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, as of 2 days ago, estimated these to be the number of civilians killed, just over 1,000, and some more injured. And you can see the breakup between government-controlled territory and territory controlled by the self-proclaimed republics. The actual number is probably higher. Some say it's much higher, but I think on that, the jury's out. We'll have to wait and see till the fighting ceases. But we know that in the meantime, in addition to these civilian casualties, there's been wholesale destruction of infrastructure, including healthcare facilities, transportation networks, recreation buildings, industries, factories, and much else. And in Mariupol, we believe that as much as 80% of residential infrastructure may already have been destroyed. Thank you. That's all we need for the moment, Ben. There is, I think, a good deal of soul searching. Because in addition to what I've just been quoting, there are, of course, the military casualties. The Russian side says they've incurred 1,300 or so soldiers killed. NATO's estimate of Russian deaths of soldiers is greater, as you would expect. In terms of Ukrainian soldiers killed, the Ukrainian government's estimate is 1,300 again, and the Russian estimate is 14,000. Probably it's somewhere in between the low and the high estimates in each case. Now, there is no doubt that the Russian action has been brewing for some considerable time, not in the specifics that we've seen, but in some form, as a result of what they consider provocation, humiliation, intimidation, and threats. But this said, I still regard the use of force as unjustified and unjustifiable, and probably not the ideal solution to the problem. And in addition to the casualties, of course, we have sanctions. The freezing of assets of the Russian central bank and Russian sovereign funds, excluding Russia from the SWIFT messaging system, the suspension of the Nord Stream 2 gas, and a host of other measures to limit Russian exports of oil, gas, and wheat. And the point about this is that this will no doubt hurt the Russian economy, but as important, it will hurt the global economy. We will see a very substantial rise in prices, not just of oil and gas, but also of food commodities. And the international financial system, delicate and precarious at the best of times, is going to go through a very volatile period in many parts of the world, including the West. The third stake for us who are located in the West is the abject failure of Western governments to tell the truth. With Western media, including publicly funded media, wittingly or otherwise, echoing the sound bites of the US security establishment. What we hear on public networks, broadcasting networks, as well as in the other mainstream commercial media, is the result of a comprehensive disinformation campaign based on half-truths, propaganda, spin, and outright deception. I don't have time to illustrate it all. This might be able to come up in a subsequent discussion. But the toll, political, cultural, psychological, will be felt for years to come. I suspect it will be felt for decades to come, particularly as the truth begins to come out on so many different fronts. But without doubt, the most frightening casualty of all is not any of these things, very serious though they are. It is the possible return, some would say the likely return, to a full-scale Cold War. The crisis even now is approaching the danger levels of the first major crisis of the old Cold War, which took us between the late 40s and the late 80s. And I'm referring to the Berlin crisis. It is as serious as the Berlin crisis. The danger of a Russian-US military confrontation has never been greater since the end of the old Cold War. The talk of no-fly zones, peddled by US allies, the delivery of lethal military aid to the area of conflict, the possible implication of nuclear power plants mishaps, And the possibility of nuclear confrontation, whether by accident or miscalculation, is greater than at any time since the end of the Cold War in the 1980s. As most of you will know, there is a thing called the Doomsday Clock, which is overseen by some of the world's leading scientists. And not long ago, they set it at about 90 seconds to midnight. If they were meeting right now, it is my considered judgment that they would set it at 60 seconds to midnight, the closest it has been to midnight since World War II. If we may have slide 2, please. So how did we get into this mess? Well, NATO's expansion in Europe post-1989 holds much of the key to it. And you can see on this map how from the original dark blue, the initial members of NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, the alliance led by the US, which links US, Canada, and Western Europe, has shifted, and in particular has shifted remorselessly since the end of the Cold War, closer and closer and closer to Russia's border. And if anyone was going to see red, certainly Putin was going to see red with this development. And he has been saying this to the whole world for everyone to hear, that this situation is unacceptable to Russia. Just as it would be unacceptable for Russia to have troops as close to the American border in Latin America. And we know what the Cuban Missile Crisis was about some 60 years ago. If we go to the next slide, it's not just membership of NATO, but you can see here NATO ground and air bases right across NATO countries and getting closer and closer to the border with Ukraine and in parts to the border with Russia. A policy of encirclement, the old policy of containment, but with much greater reach than ever before during the Cold War period, where basically it stopped in the heart of Germany, between West and East Germany. But all that has now shifted. They're not just allies, but they're deploying on their soil, as you can see, bases and troops, which have been increasing even in the last 4 weeks that the Ukraine crisis has been going. Thank you. I think we've seen enough of that slide. Thanks, Ben. So this is one of the factors that has got us into this mess, and a very major factor. The situation in Ukraine itself is the second factor. We have seen over the last 20 or so years the removal of 2 Ukrainian governments in highly suspicious circumstances, governments which weren't exactly pro-Russian, but they were at least open to the idea of paying attention to Russian sensitivities. And they have been replaced by governments strongly hostile to Russia, right even closer to Russia's long border with the Ukraine. And complicating the issue has been the rise of extreme nationalist elements. Some call them neo-Nazis. I prefer to call them extreme nationalist elements inside Ukraine. And there's been an ongoing process of arming them, funding them, and they now have become increasingly influential in Ukrainian politics, to the point that their support is now seen by many aspiring politicians in Ukraine as crucial to their political ambitions. And the final factor, which connects with all those, is what I call US delusions of grandeur. What do I mean by that? The United States still operates with a view that it won the Cold War back in the 80s, and that therefore it is the victor that is entitled to hold sway on a global scale. And if there are any emerging adversaries or those who wish to challenge its supremacy, be it Russia today, China tomorrow, or perhaps someone else further down the track, they're not going to accept the challenge. They're not prepared to accept the coexistence of great power from the past and a resurgent power that is Russia and a rising power that is China. And indeed, we can, to some extent, make sense of the approach of the United States through sanctions, through the squeeze, through the expansion of NATO, etc., all the other things we've discussed briefly, as an attempt to bleed Russia dry. That's what it is. And if need be, to make use of the victims of the conflict now waging in Ukraine as pawns in this grand geopolitical game, because they want Russia to be somehow disposed of as a major challenge to American power before they go on to handle the true adversary, as they see it, the rising one, which is China. And that is a very dangerous delusion. It is interesting to note that though the US had enough muscle to get a resolution up through the UN General Assembly, when it came to imposing sanctions, the majority of the world's countries have refused to follow suit. Certainly China has, even allies have. Turkey has refused, India has refused, South Africa, and many, many others in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. So we're in a mess. We're in a real mess and a dangerous one. How do we get out of it? The short answer is with the greatest of difficulty. The road ahead is strewn with roadblocks, but try we must, because this is one of the most perilous moments since World War II. And so I would like to propose 6 key steps, not because they are the final solution, not because everyone has to accept these 6 steps, but they are suggestive of a path which might possibly lead us out of the abyss. The first, and obviously the first major step, which many are calling for, is an immediate ceasefire. An immediate ceasefire, which will probably not happen tomorrow, but whether tomorrow or the next day or the next week, the demand for an immediate ceasefire must get louder and louder and louder. It is a ceasefire in which both sides, at this point, Russia and the Ukraine, gain something and concede something. The Ukrainians would gain in the cessation of the destruction that has been inflicted on them. It would require Russia to forego the advantage that it might gain through more fighting. But they would have to concede something, which would be Russia's gain, that the Ukraine is fully committed to considering seriously all of Russia's legitimate grievances and concerns, whether they be within the Ukraine or in terms of its position within the global geopolitical struggle I've described. Second step, no further, once ceasefire is agreed to, no further delivery of lethal military aid to Ukraine, and a massive global program to deal with the humanitarian crisis. And this ideally would be a ceasefire which is monitored under UN auspices. This would lead the way to the serious negotiations I have mentioned. They would be aimed at dealing with Russia's long-standing concerns, and in return, as these concerns are seriously looked at and dealt with, there would be a quick, a rapid, phased withdrawal of Russian forces from Ukrainian territory. How to get these negotiations moving? Fourth step. It could be ideally, in an ideal world at least, facilitated by the good offices of the UN Secretary General. He has not played his cards as well as he might have so far. I say UN Secretary General because nothing can be done through the UN General Assembly or the UN Security Council. But the UN Secretary General, we have to admit, is a very weak reed. It will need to be him, because it's a man, Guterres, acting with the support of other key actors. It'll be offering their good offices to the negotiation between the two parties directly involved. I'm thinking of a possible quartet of key actors, very carefully chosen. China, on the one hand, because of its close association, close links with Russia. France, on the other, because it is one of America's major NATO allies in Europe. And it is the one country in NATO that has, with the exception of Turkey, managed to have very good relations with the Ukraine and a reasonable rapport with Putin. In fact, over the last 4 weeks or so, 22 or 23 hours of direct communication between the two of them privately. There must be something happening there about which we will hear more, no doubt, in weeks to come. And step 5, once substantial agreements are reached, even if not on every point, even if not perfectly, but sufficient progress, then it's time for the Russian forces to withdraw. And the establishment of a large, maybe very large, UN peacekeeping force, which may need to remain in operation for at least 2 years, could be longer. A peacekeeping force in which neither the United States, nor Russia, nor any of their allies participate. And the 6th step, the most important step at the end of this process, is substantive discussions between Russia and the United States and their respective allies on nuclear disarmament and demilitarization as part of a new European-wide framework. A security framework based on the notion of common security, cooperative security, and comprehensive security, including climate change and other environmental issues. You might say a tall order. Nothing of this is going to happen easily. It certainly won't happen without a massive global awakening of human energies, dedicated to the pursuit of something like this program, not in all its detail. Much detail would need to be worked out, but something of that current, using every conceivable peaceful tool at our disposal. It must incorporate artists, entertainers, intellectuals, workers, students, every sector of civil society. And the message must be loud and clear, using every device at our disposal. No doubt the journey ahead is daunting, but may I suggest we dare not fail. Thank you.
Thank you, Joe. And I can see that there are plenty of questions that are coming in on the chat, and please keep putting them in. But in the meantime, I'm going to turn to our panel, to Lee and Rana, to lead off the questions. Go ahead, Rana, if there's something from you.
Well, the conversation is really interesting. I was going, yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. But I was going to ask before the conversation if it is, because I find it really hard to predict what will happen. but I assume after this presentation, I can say it is predictable, but it's the matter of, again, the scholars and the theoreticians and those who can predict, and the level of attention of politicians right now, because it's becoming very political. It is a mess. It has different aspects of politics and economics. And Joe, do you think they gain out of it as well? Because there is especially a gain in selling the weapons and like those who are supporting wars. Do you think they are stronger than the peacemakers and those who are following the situation to make peace?
Well, two very big questions. Of course, behind the sanctions, for example, this is a big question, and one little part of it, behind the sanctions, it's not just will make life very difficult for Russia. Behind the sanctions, which are masterminded, of course, by the United States, and others follow as best they can, the aim is to advantage US interests. So yes, there's going to be less oil and gas coming from Russia, for example, to Western Europe. Who will make up the deficit? The United States will stand ready to supply it, even if the price is 2, 3, or 4 times higher than would be the price of oil and gas coming from Russia. But they'll have no alternative, and they'll have to accept it, even if it involves fracking with massive environmental implications inside the United States and possibly beyond. So yes, there are powerful interests, okay? And I need to be brutal about your question because it's so important. As things stand right this minute, those pressing for war are much more powerful than those pressing for peace. Much more powerful. And they feed on each other to some extent. They feed on each other. And that makes it like a vicious circle. And if we cast our mind back to events like the Vietnam War, the height of the Cold War in the 80s, it took massive energy, scale on a big scale, global scale, and preparation and persistence over years, not just a few weeks or months, to begin to turn it around. So it's not going to be as of now that you can easily turn it around, but you can start with small steps. And that's why I thought a gentle first step is to build up pressure for a ceasefire in return for serious negotiations about the outstanding issues. That should be able to gather massive support around the globe from everywhere. So we'll have to wait and see.
Lee, question from you.
Thanks, Suzanne. Maybe a couple of comments or reflections before a question or two, and I might pick up on some questions that the audience have asked. But I suppose one tension I'm wrestling with after having listened to your talk, Joe, is the question of what we may have done or how we may have better responded other than simply with sanctions and not curtailing to the rhetoric of war, be it through no-fly zones and what that might precipitate or otherwise. And also, I suppose what the Ukraine crisis has done is galvanized a lot of people's good feeling towards the people of Ukraine, and they are dying, as your slide showed. So, I mean, I'm not being particularly articulate here, but there is an inherent tension there in terms of us wanting to support them. And then the question becomes how to do so. And I take from your presentation that your view on sanctions and certainly military aid is that is to say you're against such measures. And you please correct me if I'm being too presumptive in saying that. But I suppose with all the people dying on the ground and us needing to reflect on what Putin's objectives are in the Ukraine, that is to say, what might he want to do in attacking Ukraine, and what may his longer term objectives be. My question is, how may we reflect on that, and how might we better respond to that other than with sanctions and a push towards military conflict?
Yes, well, why don't you ask a hard question? No, it's a very important one. There are so many aspects to it. The one thing that we should all have been saying and must say now, though we haven't said it in the past, we must say not just to the government of Ukraine, but to all the people in Ukraine, a hostile attitude to Russia is a no-brainer. You can't do that. You can't do that. You can't do that. You have to find a way of accommodation. And one of the, which I didn't talk about, one of the keys to that is no membership of NATO. Okay. Now, the Russian offensive has been far more successful than the Western media would let us believe. Far more successful. I don't know whether it's on track or not. It may not be, but it's been successful. Already the concessions are beginning to come from the Ukrainian side. They have said neutrality, no problem. But they didn't say that 2 months ago. They didn't say that for the last 10 or 15 or 20 years. And that's because we didn't push in that direction. It's because we wanted to, governments wanted to, Western governments, and particularly the United States, wanted to open that possibility of Ukraine one day becoming a member. So a neutral Ukraine is an excellent idea that should be pushed. And that is one of the main objectives of the Russians. You ask, what are the Russian objectives? There are 3 immediate objectives, which have been spelt out time and time and time again. And you know what? The Western media don't report them. Putin makes an hour speech, oh, rant, crazy. You know, Trump, compared to Trump. But Trump gets reported. Every word he says is reported. Crazy. But Putin, the crazy one, doesn't get reported. How can you know what he's up to unless you have a serious discussion of what he's saying? And ministers. And how many times have we seen in the media one serious interview with a leading Russian scholar? How many times in Australia? Or in the UK, not many. And that's because we're closing options rather than opening them. So that's part of the answer. We have to open up options. Russian objectives, there are 3 in the immediate sense. The 3, neutrality for Ukraine. 2, no lethal weapons, Western lethal weapons deployed in the Ukraine aimed at Russia. And thirdly, an arrangement, and I think there's room for negotiation there, in the 2 separatist regions that would be acceptable to Russia, which may fall short of themselves being declared independent republics, as they have done. They may settle for less than that, but certainly they want an arrangement which is much more satisfactory to the Russian community, Russian-speaking community, and to them. Now, do they have longer-term objectives? Oh, yes, they do. Wouldn't we, if we were Russians, wouldn't we want to have the longer term objectives of removing as many of these hostile bases and military deployments on our doorstep elsewhere? So they would be keen to enter into a serious discussion about the redrawing of the political configuration in Europe. to something that had been hoped for at the end of the Cold War, but which hasn't come to pass. So there is a lot there. There are options that if governments can't take, because they are stuck in their particular positions for the time being, there is nothing to prevent an informed, thoughtful public to seriously be discussing them and in some cases advocating them. That's my answer. In short, it mightn't seem short, but that's the short of it.
I might just then ask one more question, Joe, and thank you for that and your reflections. There's a lot to digest and unpack there, and I'm sure the series will offer more opportunity to do so beyond this short presentation. But I see one question from the audience which follows on from that, is your first objective being a ceasefire in Ukraine. What might persuade Russia to do so? What might the impetus behind stopping the current actions be? And I suppose the question may have come about following remarks about sanctions not being the best means of dealing with Russia at this point in time, and certainly military aid or a no-fly zone, which I still need to reflect on myself in terms of that position. But in terms of how a ceasefire might be achieved, what might be the incentive for Russia right now to lay down its arms?
Well, I've said in my brief comments, it has to be a quid pro quo. Both sides have to gain something, both sides have to concede something. Russia would concede the stopping at this point of its offensive. The forces stay where they are, but they don't know they're no longer fire. That's a big concession. But the Ukraine has to concede that all the major concerns that Russia has put on the table for some considerable time are now going to be the subject of serious negotiation. Serious negotiation with implications for, in some cases, constitutional amendments to Ukraine's constitution. That is already virtually gained, almost. The detail hasn't been worked out, but Zelensky has said more than once, neutrality is not an issue. We're prepared to talk about it. The other two are more difficult, but to accept that there are issues that need to be discussed and to get the negotiating process going. So both sides would gain something, both sides would concede something, and usually in wars, that happens when they're absolutely exhausted from the destruction each has inflicted on the other. Let's hope that with wise counsels, it will not have to reach that point.
Okay, might be time to take a few more questions from the audience through the chat. I think Lee's going to keep asking those questions. If you've got them there.
Yeah, I'll gladly do that. Joe, you started your presentation commenting on the West media in the West, and in particular echoing the US military establishments. I mean, that's just from my notes, but following on from that, one person has asked, what is your take on the Western media? Now, following that comment at the start of your presentation, perhaps you can just unpack that a little bit more for the audience and offer a couple more reflections on how you think the Western media has portrayed the conflict and what that has done to the narrative, particularly in the Western Australia.
Well, what it has done, Australia everywhere, but needs to be qualified a bit, the everywhere part, everywhere in the West, it has painted a picture of Russia as the ogre and Ukraine as the angel. Well, it ain't that simple. It's very complex. There are unpleasant things that both sides have done, and there are some legitimate concerns that both sides have. That has not come across because there has been such emphasis on painting Zelensky as hero on the side of the angel, in fact, an archangel, and Putin as crazy, as nationalist, as having lost it, and so on and so on. Now, and they've gone further. And most of it, much of it, not most of it, much of it, I will admit, it comes because many in the Western media, except for notable exceptions, apart from notable exceptions, are not really terribly well versed in these issues. And so they're looking for information. There's not a lot of information. It comes in dribs and drabs, the odd speech here and there, from Russia. But there is an avalanche of information coming from the United States, in particular security agencies and think tanks that are very close to them. Well, how are you going to take them on? What they're telling you must surely be true. So, for example, the Western media have painted a picture of this operation, invasion, war, call it what you like, having grand objectives, which were way beyond Russia's capacity. Only a fool would aim for that. And I assure you of one thing, Putin is no fool. He is cautious, he's calculating, and he's utterly ruthless. And usually he wins. And usually he wins, and he's usually 2 steps ahead of the Americans. And probably that'll happen here too. Fortunately or unfortunately, I pass no moral judgment on that. So what he wanted 3 very specific objectives. He may not have judged accurately how quickly he could gain them. Maybe, I don't know. I'm not privy to that information. So what the military industrial establishment, especially in the United States, have sought to do is to create a picture of unlimited objectives by this man, which are grotesque and awful and terrible and must be obviously opposed tooth and nail. And then a very interesting sideshow story, which says, well, you know what? He's going to be a complete failure because he's not going to live up to these grand objectives, which he has never spoken, or some of his ministers, his most senior ministers, have never spoken of, but which have been assumed or projected onto him, onto the Russian government. So that it is this composite picture. Of course, there is a lot of detail. And in war, there's always misinformation on both sides. Truth is invariably the casualty. And both sides are probably not telling us the full truth. But the idea, you see, that neither side, including the Western side, may not be telling the truth, doesn't seem to have entered the minds of many of those reporting or analyzing who get featured, including on the ABC, SBS, and etc., BBC, and so on. So that's very, very unfortunate. And we have to we must speak truth to power and remind the powerful that truth remains the supreme good that we must aim for, even in war, even when we dislike the actions of the opponent, truth. And there are many things that the West and the Americans are doing in the Ukraine, which, to be honest, don't bear repeating. Awful things, terrible things, including supporting and arming extreme nationalist elements inside Ukraine. So that's the kind of lack of objectivity that we've seen. I'm not expecting, nor should we expect, Western media to mouth support for the Russian position or Putin's views, but at least there should be a dispassionate attempt to see what exactly are the issues on the 2 sides, what is the gap, how has it got there, what might we be able to do about it, and ideally without recourse to the use of force that kills and maims and destroys.
Okay, thank you, Joe, for giving that insightful answer. I'm going to, I know that there are plenty of questions that we still have, but I'm going to now start drawing to a close. And I just wanted to give my sincere thanks to Professor Joe Camilleri and to Rana Abrahimi and to Lee Monique for joining us and asking those really insightful questions and for also taking those questions from the audience. That's been really great to hear about your 6-point plan. And also, I just wanted to let everyone know that we've recorded this session, so you can go back and watch this at your own leisure if you'd like. I'd also like to encourage people to take us up on that opportunity to register for the seminar series, which will be 7 weeks of really amazing presentations, and also ways that you can learn how to discuss this topic and more in a way which is really going to draw out those different opinions from you and your friends and colleagues, and also build those skills. And also, I think on the flyer, there are 7 people that are going to be joining us, including Alexei Gromyko, who is the director of the Institute of the Europe of Russian Academy of Sciences, and has also done a lot of work with foreign affairs with the Russian ministry. So there's also plenty of other people that are joining us at that event, different events for the seminar series: Shireen Morris and Yanis Varoufakis and Jeff Raby. On our website, you can see who those people are. So please take the time to have a look. And don't forget to use our special code that we've given for the next 48 hours, cross10, when you're registering, and you'll get that special 10% off. So thanks again for joining us, and have a great rest of your evening.